Big day.
Big day.
Listen, fantasy lovers, unite. Fatamates, we are here for you. We are here for you. We haven't been here for you very much, but we are here for you today.
I feel like when we do appear for you in this way, we bring you only the best.
Exactly.
Zoraida. Right? And now today, we're going to be joined by author Sara J. Maas.
I mean, no big deal.
Well, here, I've said this in the podcast, but Little Romance, thinks this whole entire life I live is completely horrifying. I actually asked him one day, I was like, do any of your friends know about the podcast? And he was like, no.
Mom, I would never.
He's like, I will die. But I told him that we were interviewing Sara J. Maas, and he was like, oh, impressed with me.
Oh,
so
suddenly
there you go.
You just leveled up.
Yes. Sara J. Maas.
Listen, amazing. There comes a point in every child's life where they start to come around to, maybe my mom isn't so awful.
See, I think we're getting there.
That helped. So you're welcome.
Sarah's Sara J. Maas's newest book in the Crescent City series is called House of Sky and Breath, and it came out yesterday. So we are here to talk with Sara today about writing the second book. I've been in my brain calling this the Empire Strikes Back episode, right? Because second books are really interesting. And I also quiz our Sara about some of the things about second books. So Sara J. Maas is she's a super interesting person. It's fascinating to hear her talk about her books.
P.S. So darling.
Yeah, we had a great conversation. So welcome to Fated Mates, everyone. I'm Jennifer Prokop, a romance reader and editor.
I'm Sarah McLean, a romance reader and author, and we are so thrilled to bring to you, straight from sunny California, the brilliant Sara J. Maas. Well, we are really thrilled to have you, Sara. And I know from personal experience, from having received emails from you, that you are a romance fan. And of course, literally anybody who's ever read a Sara J. Maas novel,
knows
that you are a romance fan. But I know for sure I have it documented. So maybe we could start there with how did you come to know romance, to read it? Did you come through YA? Did you read it when you were a kid? What's your sort of journey to romance?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I am so excited as a fangirl to be speaking to you, Sara.
Same.
I am in a disgusting pit sweats right now because I'm just so excited to be here talking to you. But yes, I am a huge romance fan, and it actually started later in my life. I mean, I'm still relatively young. Yeah. Kind of
someone
mid-30s.
On TikTok called me a classic romance author today, and I was I just need to measure out my grade now. No, I don't like it, TikTok.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, I can. You are also relatively young. So.
Yes, I'm relatively young, so I didn't discover romance until I want to say I was in my mid-late 20s, and I think until that point, I had just read fantasy, sci-fi, that stuff. And that it was funny because the stuff I always gravitated towards in the series I loved the most, as a kid and a teenager, were anything with romance in them. If the story didn't have romance and kissing or by the time I got a little older, lots of sex, I was not into them. I needed that. And I didn't realize it, that I was romance was the thing I was mostly drawn towards. So I forget how I kind of fell into the romance world. Probably someone recommended a book to me and I can't even remember. I have the worst memory of all time, by the way, just fair warning right now. But as soon as I, discovered it, I think it might've started with J.R. Ward or Nalini Singh's series. And I was just oh my God, this is exactly,
this is the best stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And then, someone eventually recommended historical romance to me, which then that was a whole binge thing. But I think I had this misconception from an early age, thanks to the man and like male society, that romance was like, you know, not like good. Like I just like I'd never even gone into the romance section. And then suddenly I was, you know, going into the bookstore and just running to the romance section, being like, what sounds like, you know, the coolest, but also the smuttiest. And like, I just devoured it from there. And then I just was so moved to discover that there was this whole genre, like, you know, written mostly like by women, like for women, and like with empowering stories about like, you know, women like seizing their own destinies and sexuality. And like, that's like all the stuff I love to write about too, like just in like a different fantasy section, a different fantasy genre. But like, I don't know, like once the floodgates opened, it was like, there was no stopping it. And like, now I'm like, I won't read anything without romance. And it's crazy to me to like still see how silly people, especially guys, are about like romance as a genre. Like, not to go on like a whole tangent and like rant about like the evil men. But like my husband was just meeting up with a friend who lives in LA. Like we just moved to LA. And so we're reconnecting with old friends, at least before this variant like destroyed any sense of normalcy again. And this friend was like, said to Josh, like, you know, word on the street is that Sarah's books have a lot of sex in them. And like, I was like, was his tone
yeah,
like
they do.
He's into it or like dismissive? And Josh was like, I don't know. But like, it was like this thing like that, like he was somehow seeing me differently. Like this friend was seeing me differently for having books, you know, with sex. And like, well, good. Like I want to read books with sex in them.
You're like, word on the street is that many people's lives have a lot of sex in them. I'm not sure if you've heard. Right?
Honestly, the hardest thing about writing, and like, you know, maybe you guys agree, like the hardest thing about like writing books with sex in them is having family members read those books. Like my dad like, I don't know if he still reads my current ones because they've just gotten so unbelievably like graphically detailed that I don't think there's much for him to read.
Jen and I were saying like, oh, there are some concrete nouns in this one that you can immediately find the sex bits if you need to find them.
Oh yes. And it's just like I can handle like I can handle like strangers or friends reading, but like when it's my family members, like my 90-year-old grandma, like I will never forget when A Court of Mist and Fury, the second book in the ACOTAR series, was coming out. My grandma was like, oh, I'm so excited to read it. And I was like, well, grandma, like there is a lot of sex in this one. And like A Court of Mist and Fury was like the first book where I had like pretty like graphic, like on page sex. And my grandma was like, basically like, well, if there's lots of sex in it, it sounds right up my alley.
Oh,
and
grandma.
I was like, one, like, yay, empowered sexual, like grandma, but like also like,
grandma.
No, grandma, no.
Oh, that's amazing.
Oh, we love your grandma. She can come on the show anytime.
So I'm sure she'd have a lot to say. She's 90 years old. She's lived a very full, adventurous life, lots of travel around the world. I don't want to even go down that like mental path of what she's done all over the world.
So wait, can we talk about that actually? Because I think the first time I ever, I don't read very much fantasy at all. And I started out, I have a lot of friends who write YA. And I think the first time I ever heard your name, it was like, you should read Sarah J. Maas because her books are really sexy. And at the time I was like, yeah, but they're YA. So like, hi, I'm me. And these are YA. Like, how sexy are we talking? And, people were like, oh no, like, she's the one who's like allowed, quote, to do it, right? And this was long enough ago. Not again, we're all very young here, but this was long enough ago that it was very rare, right? You would, my first book is a YA novel, and I published with Scholastic, which is a whole different kind of thing.
Yeah,
but they were like, no, it was like, I Love Lucy. Like they had to be in separate. They couldn't. Well, there was a bedroom scene, but like one of them had to have their feet on the floor, right? So like so I have this question because like, did you feel like at any moment was there a conversation where there was a discussion of, well, like kids, teenagers, like the genre, how do you fit sex into it? I do feel like you sort of blazed a trail there that was useful for a lot of other writers.
Well, that makes me feel a lot cooler than I am in my day-to-day life. So the first series that I had come out was my Throne of Glass series, and the first 2 books in that series were like fairly like, I guess, like YA tame. Like, you know, there was some kissing in the first one, and then there was sex in the second one, but it was fade to black. And it was interesting. Like, this is kind of a slight side note, but I remember when I was writing Crown of Midnight, the second book in the Throne of Glass series, the original sex scene, like it was a fade to black sex scene, but then there was like an after scene where Selena / Aelin was like discussing, like, you know, how she felt with her partner, like after having sex for the first time. And I got a lot of pushback from that. Like, you know, my publisher these days, like, I'm working with a whole different team, like at my publisher, it's like different whole crowd. But like there was a line where she initially said, like, you know, I'm like sore, but I'm good. Which, like, after my first time is like kind of like how I felt. Sure. And like that we got pushback from that, just saying like, no, like you can't like say that, basically. Like, you know, you can't talk about being sore. And like, so I had to change the line. Like, it was like a whole thing where I was like, but this is accurate. Like, this is, I mean, some women aren't sore. Like, great, good for you. It's amazing. But like, you know, I that was not my experience. And like, it was like my first time was a really happy, wonderful experience. But yeah, like afterwards I was like, ooh, like I feel a little tender down there. And so like we wound, like it was a battle that I, in hindsight, wish I had like just really like fought a little harder for. But you know, there was my second book out there in the world. So I just was like, I was like, okay.
And you just sort of
yeah. So like, you're like, okay, I'm going to trust you guys. Like, if you're telling me that like retailers won't pick it up because of this one line, like fine.
Right. So, you'll never get into clubs and fairs.
Exactly. Like, you know, it was, and
why like, and children's publishing is a huge
is everything.
Puzzle,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And like, this was like 10 years ago. Like it was a while ago. But so I changed the line from like, you know, I'm tired, but happy. Like, I'm tired instead of sore was acceptable. Yeah. And like, I'm like, okay, like tired, like maybe they were up all night banging or something, like, which like, all right, whatever. But like that, so like, that was kind of my first encounter, like with like having sex, like in YA. And I was kind of like, this is bullshit. Like, because like the books that I read when I was a teenager, you know, like YA wasn't like as much of a thing back. Like, it existed, but it wasn't like the thing it is now. So like I read adult fantasy that had like lots of sex in it. And that was my introduction as a young woman to sex, and not just like sex, but like positive relationships, and like that, like I could like demand like pleasure from sex. And like, that was so important to me. And that was something that I wanted to have reflected in my writing, not in like a, like, this is my soapbox. I would just, cause like, I found that to be like the most exciting way to write about sex. So back then I did not have a child yet. So I had plenty of time to work on multiple books at once. And one of the series that I had that I wanted to get out there was my Court of Thorns and Roses series. So Throne of Glass, I think, had 2 books or 3 books out by the time the first ACOTAR book released. And we had a whole debate about ACOTAR and like where it would be shelved, because I said, when I sold it to my publisher, I do not want to have to sacrifice the sex scenes in this. Like, this is like, I didn't write it as YA. I wrote it as like new adult, like when new adult was like kind of
thing,
going to be a thing.
Yeah,
but
there
by
was
the time
a heartbeat. Yeah, we should explain that. So there was a heartbeat in kind of the late aughts, early like 10s, where there was a genre called new adult, and that was contemporary romance with younger
like
characters. They were in college
like,
age.
Yeah, college age. Like, kind of like, you know, I mean, the name says it all, right? Like, these are people just starting their lives. And there's like a time when a lot of people are having like their first relationships. Yeah. So, you know, and these are, you know, 20, 22, 24-year-olds. So.
Yeah. And that was kind of like, you know, Feyre fell within that kind of like age bracket. So I was like, oh, this will be new adult fantasy. And by the time, ACOTAR was getting ready to come out into the world, new adult kind of like not manifested. And there were a lot of discussions about, okay, where do we shelve this series? Like, do we push it into the adult market? Or like, do we have it in YA? And I mean, this is very technical, boring publishing stuff, but they kind of figured like, my Throne of Glass series was just kind of like taking off in YA, like, let's keep like the shelf visibility there and launch it there. And I said, okay, like that's fine. Like, if you guys are on board with me, like writing about like sex and like, like women being like empowered in their sexuality and like on screen, like on page sex, like,
right.
Okay, fine. Like, let's do it. Like, I know we're going to like, have a lot of people be like, what the fuck? Like, you can't write about that. But yeah, so like, it was kind of like my publisher's decision to shelve it in YA. I mean, the first ACOTAR book was like kind of like there was sex, but like not like that bad, like all things considered. But then Mist and Fury,
or that good, you mean?
Not that good,
not that good. Yes, not as detailed, not as many like nouns and adjectives. But yeah, then Mist and Fury came out a year after that, and that was like the kind of like, I think
that's when people were like, "Oh, you got to read Sarah J. Maas." Like, you're gonna. It's Sarah. If you're Sarah, they were like, Sarah McLean. If you're ever gonna go fantasy, this is where you're. This is it. Like, this is your shot.
and like after that, I just was like that was like that book still holds like a very special place in my heart. And at that point, I was working with a different editor who said to me like, I want all of this here, like on the page. Like, this is an important part of Sarah's journey.
It really like changes everything, right? I mean, who's supportive of it.
Yeah, and she said like, I'll go to the mat for you, and like, and she saw like, she understood the importance of that sex in the book. And then it was interesting. So like, ACOTAR kind of just like went to like straight on like, sexy time stuff, but then my Throne of Glass series. That kind of evolved to have like some fairly graphic sex stuff like later on in the books, which like I was very happy to be able to write, but it was kind of like, this was YA, like, it's like kind of like an evolution of like, going from kind of a clean, I don't like the word like clean, like when talking about sex, but like relatively tame stuff to like, characters having like actual, like fully fledged sexual relationships. But, I don't know, like, it's like what I love to like read and like write about. And like, I don't care if people are like, she's a pervert, but like, that's like what makes, like, I think it's just, I don't know.
I mean, I think the thing that's so tricky is, as it turns out, I don't know if people are aware, it's a secret I hold, but teenagers do have sex, everybody.
No.
But it's adults who struggle with that knowledge, right? And so this is something where, I mean, I think it's important for like readers of YA to get a full range of like whatever those experiences are.
Yeah.
Because I was that kind of teenager. I wanted to read it. It was to me like such a safe place to experience.
Yes.
This, I didn't have to do it myself.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm just going to pause here and say, I want to just point to, there's currently a lawmaker in Oklahoma who has just introduced a law that would charge public school librarians $10,000 a day for every day a book with sexual content that has been protested by a parent stays on the shelf. So this is one of those situations where like support librarians.
I hope they're going to take out the Bible.
Right?
I mean, right? Like, you're like,
support public school librarians. We'll put links in show notes to everything so that you can, tell people that this is ridiculous, and also call your lawmakers in Oklahoma if you live there.
It's just like unfucking believable. Like, I'm sorry. Like, that is just no, but I think like you're absolutely right though, because I read tons of books with sex in them when I was a teenager. And I think because it was a safe place, like I did not go like on a single date in high school. Like I didn't start really getting like sexually active till I was in college. And it's because I wasn't ready. And like, I feel like,
right.
maybe some kids don't, but like I knew what I was ready for, what I wasn't ready for, and like, you know, learning about this stuff and like reading it in books, like, you know, that was a safe place for me to do it. And like
practice, right?
Learning about it through a series, with a character who you love and are following on her journey is a huge piece we've talked about this before on the podcast, but for many, many of us, like, this is how we came to understand sex as something that could be pleasurable, something that you could do with somebody who cared about you, something that allowed for like
your decision, right?
Something, care, like your choice, etc. And so I think with ACOTAR, I'm curious, because you're actually here to talk about second stories in series. Yes. Whatever. We can talk about, we could talk to you all day, Sarah. But I think you brought up this kind of, you know, the second book in that series is where you're not here to talk about sex on page, but it's where we start to see her really become all the things that she could be. And so maybe this is where we can start talking about this like second book phenomenon. This week's episode of Fated Mates is sponsored by Sara Wetmore, author of Brushstrokes, which is out this week.
Brushstrokes is a story of Emily, a professional painter who is unhappy in her marriage, but then finds out her husband's been cheating on her.
No, dead.
Look, we're ruthless here at Fated Mates. It doesn't matter, because Emily, in an effort to like get her life together, takes on a roommate to help pay the mortgage. Roommate has a handsome Scottish landscaper friend named Robin.
Yeah, best roommate. Discounted rent for the hot Scot.
Hot Scot.
No, but listen, so I'm for this, because when you are post-divorce, you should absolutely smash the Scottish landscaper.
Without a doubt. This is a story about a woman going through lots of life events, not just the divorce, the new friends.
Just the smashing of the landscaper.
The smashing of the landscaper. Some things are going up with her mother, and Emily is really torn between how to manage her feelings and also getting what she wants in life. Brushstrokes is out this week.
You can find out more about Brushstrokes, as always, in show notes. Or if you're using a smart podcasting app, you can click on the chapter title right now and it'll take you to a link where you can buy the book. Otherwise, learn more about Sara at sarawetmore.com.
And on Instagram at writing Sara, S-A-R-A.
Thanks so much to Sara Wetmore for sponsoring the show.
To me, like, the primordial second story is The Empire Strikes Back. And this is how I pitched this idea. Let's have the Empire Strikes Back episode. And listen, you know the reason I love The Empire Strikes Back, everybody? Because it's where Han Solo and Princess Leia kiss.
Yes.
Right? Like, hello?
Yes.
And as a child, I was like, what is this? Right? So, you know, this idea of like but it's also what I think is interesting, and I'm not a writer, so I'm going to let you two take it away, is I was actually telling Sarah before, I like made a list of some of my favorite romances in a series where I love the second book best. And it was quickly like 20 series long where I like love the second book. So how do you and we were talking about like, there's a difference where if it's a trilogy or 4 books versus, you know, IAD that's 20 books, like that second book is different. So I think this is like really interesting to hear writers talk about like why the second book matters, and also to give you a chance to talk about House of Sky and Breath.
Well, it's funny because House of Sky and Breath is also like a sexual escalation book where like, you know,
it is.
And that wasn't like a
sex
really
deal. I love it. Sarah, I don't know if you know this, but I love a sex deal. It's like my favorite thing in romance. So you had me from the jump here.
Oh, great.
Or wait, would we say the drop?
The drop.
You had me from the drop.
Well, I mean, I kind of knew going into writing like the Crescent City series that I wanted Bryce and Hunt to like not hook up in the first book, like at all, or like, you know, have sex in the first book, just because they were two kind of like broken people at that point. And like, I think to get to that emotional level, like of like being able to trust each other and love each other enough to have sex, like that would take me like a book and a half to get to. But I also love like the foreplay stuff, like, the banter, the like physical longing, like the like, oh, his knee touched mine. Like, like it's like, like I love the buildup. Cause then like, after they have sex for the first time, you're like, okay, like how do I keep like one-upping this? Like, we got to find some new positions, some new locations. Like how do we keep building on this one?
The challenge is real.
It is. So like one of my editor's comments for Sky and Breath was actually like, can we like come up with some new locations for sex scenes that aren't like them on the couch? Like just because they just were like on the couch so much, like,
you're like they're roommates.
At each other.
Yeah, where else are they gonna do it?
Exactly. I was like, they're in an apartment. Like there's like the bed, the couch, and like I guess we can do like the shower, kitchen counter, like. But
there was the table, but Ethan broke it jumping on it with the sword, and not that kind of sword.
Oh, poor Ethan.
That's a small. Listen, that's a very small spoiler. Everybody, don't worry about it. This will not air. This will air after the book is out. I didn't spoil anything. We
should say we are going to try very hard not to do any spoilers, so this will be safe for everybody to listen to. But if you are like really, really, really excited, which many, many, many of you are, maybe read the book before we do this. Before you listen to this.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of like Ethan's. I don't know if you guys have watched Arrested Development, but like, his George Michael, like with the lightsaber in the garage.
Nice.
Yes.
But yeah, so with this book, I just kind of, I wanted, like, I needed a reason to keep them like away from each other initially. Cause like by the time book one ends, like they have started to heal. And then, as much as I wanted them to like jump each other's bones, I was like, you know what, who are they like as characters? Like, like how, like they've just gone through this incredibly traumatic thing. Like Hunt has just come out of like centuries of slavery. Bryce is starting to like heal and come out of this dark place. And, they both respect each other as adults and like respect their relationship enough to want to like delay the physical joining of that and get to know each other. Like, and also like have that kind of like relentless, like sexual tension between them. But yeah, so with like this book, it kind of just was, the waiting until book two for the sex was more like what feels genuine to these characters and like what's like the best way to tell their journey and how does the sex factor into that. And with Akatar, like I knew early on, like, Rhys was endgame. And I mean, I don't think I had like planned the 3-day like sex marathon, like really in my head that much before, like until I was like in the cabin with Rhys and Feyre, and I was like, oh yes, like they are not leaving this place for a long time because they have a lot of things to get out. But it just felt like completely like natural to the characters. And I think that's how I like approach like a lot of this, like, is this a natural progression? Like, does this feel right in the moment for both of these characters? Or, if it doesn't feel right for one of these characters, like what are the repercussions of that? Like, like how do you like, and yeah, with like sequels, like, I mean, you mentioned like Empire Strikes Back, like that is like my favorite of the Star Wars movies, in part because of like Han and Leia, but also just because I love it like when like the good guys lose and they got to get their shit together, like the end of like Infinity War, like, half the world or universe is gone. And like, what do you do after that? But there are differences, like writing, 3-book series versus a longer series. Like, how do you keep my Throne of Glass series was like 8 books long. And like, so we had a couple of like Empire Strikes Back books
moments.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I feel like the first book is usually like your introduction to the world and to the characters. And like, you're trying to cover as much ground as possible.
And it also, I don't know if you feel this way, but it also feels like the first book in any series to me is also about me learning. Like, I don't know what I'm doing in the first book. I mean, I never know what I'm doing, but it is a very real sense of like, we are all learning together. Readers.
Yes, we're all learning together. Like, let's just, and like, I think with the first book, you just kind of get glimpses and pieces of the world, the characters. You kind of place your, players on the board. And then book 2, for me, at least, has always been this opportunity to just kind of like let her rip. Like, like you really can like dive into the characters. You can like, expand the world. And I actually, the book I usually struggle with is book 3. Like, like how to like condense all of, like, how do you make all of that come together in a satisfying way? And how do you draw on the things that you introduced in book 1 and book 2 and wrap them all together rather than like constantly introducing like new crap the last minute?
Well, I think sometimes like the thing sometimes seems really hard as a reader is when book 3 is going to be like defeating the big bad, and then book 2 is just like what I describe. It's like the MacGyver moment. Like everyone's just like building shit and getting ready.
It's fun and games.
What I mean?
Right.
It's that fun and games, but but there's a point where fun and games can feel like filler, right? So it's kind of like that problem is like, well, how do I keep these characters, like their growth and development isn't just about defeating this person. But, as a reader, there have definitely been books where I was like, this is a filler book.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Like I have this stupid rule that like I probably shouldn't even like say in public, but like if I pick up a series and like I see that book 2 is like shorter than book 1, I'm like, no, like you know what, like this is going to be a filler book.
That's
like
so interesting.
Yeah, and like I would be happy to be proved wrong. Like I'm sure there are books out there that have like amazing shorter book 2, like like I'm sure that exists, but like I read enough series where like the book 2 was like not satisfying and also shorter than book 1, where I was like this. Like book 2 is your chance to like, and like, I don't know how much of that is like publisher driven where they're like, needs to be a certain length. Like there are all these kind of like nonsensical rules about that kind of, like they make sense because of like retailers and space and all that. But, like how, and like, but I also sometimes wonder like if, sometimes writers write the first book and then like, don't think further down the road about, okay, what's coming. And then they get to book 2 and they're like, what do we do? Like, how do we set up for this big ending that I have in mind?
That's the feel often is like, is book 2 important enough that it needs to be there? Right.
Yeah.
And that's certainly, we can all think of trilogies where the second book, like,
yeah, you're kind of like, this is like a bridge to the third book. And, it's fine. They can be enjoyable and like fun, but like, you're still like, okay, like, was there any major development? And that's like, I feel like I always try and hold off like on like the good stuff, like the real, like, the sex like stuff or like a big plot stuff, like until later on, like book 2, book 3, like I'm not a very strategic writer. Like I don't sit down and I'm like, here's how I like organize my books, but like just on an instinctive, like storytelling level, like as a fangirl, like I'm like, okay, like what's cool in book 1 and then like what's cooler in book 2 and like what can we build towards? And I think that's because I like, grew up watching like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, like, like Fellowship of the Ring was like epic, great. But then you have like Two Towers with like Helm's Deep and you're like, holy shit, this battle's awesome. And then you have like Return of the King with like the Battle of Pelennor Fields. And you're like, oh my God, like Helm's Deep, they had like 10,000 orcs and this is 100,000. And it's like, like increasing those stakes is so vital. And I feel like with a series, it's kind of the same. You got to like constantly keep thinking like bigger and bigger and bigger. But then also like, doubling down on your characters. Like, while like, at least in writing fantasy, like, the scope of the world's getting bigger, but then you're diving deeper into like who these characters are, what their relationships to each other are. And I think that's why I love writing like the sequels, is because it's my chance to really dive into like, who are these characters? Like, what are the weird, funny things that like, Bryce and Hunt are into? And like, like we get like a taste of that in like, the first Crescent City book with like Bryce's My Little Ponies and stuff, which is like totally based on my own obsession with My Little Ponies. Actually, Bryce's obsession with My Little Ponies only happened because I discovered like my own favorite My Little Pony in a box, like while I was working on Crescent City.
Nice.
Yeah, and she's like, she's right here. I mean, you guys can't see this. Well, so I first of all, I gave her like a haircut. I wish you guys could see this visual of her.
Beautiful. I love her.
I was like, she doesn't look like a normal My Little Pony because like she's got these long legs, like a slender neck. Yeah. And so I was like, who the fuck is this? I was like, is this a special
she
pony?
Off-brand.
And so I looked it up and she was from like this, like very small like release of like a certain type of pony that I'm blanking on right now. But like, it's not like the Starlight Fancy Dolls or whatever, like Bryce calls them, but it was like something like she was a My Little Pony, but like I clearly like some relative like probably saw her like discounted in a store and gave her to me.
She's perfect.
She's perfect. Her unicorn horn is broken. Like I shaved part of her head, but she's still beautiful. She's green and has purple hearts. But yeah, so
Sarah, will you share a photograph of her with us and we'll put it in show notes?
Yeah. I'll pose her.
You don't have to. You don't have to.
No, I will. I have like lots of crystals on my desk because I'm just that kind of person. So I will pose her
in her natural state. Yeah.
Yes, her mystical, magical
exactly.
state. Yeah, but like like just getting to explore little like things about the characters like that, and like getting to meet other new characters that are kind of like secondary. In like the first book, like Therian, like the sexy merman, he was like in book 1, but like, not like a major character, but this, he gets his own like point of view. And like, I love that book 2 can offer that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I've never written a series like yours where, it's the same couple all the way through. My series always have a different couple in every book. But I do think second books, I think you hit on the thing that I think is most powerful about the second book, which is often second books are the books where they are quieter in that not necessarily, obviously you are still swinging for the fences to make the world bigger and the action sort of more exciting and to top the book before. But the emotions of the second book often are about characters. Like, let's put 2 characters together and see how they, or in my case, 2 characters together and see how they grow and see how they change. Because you have more space for that. As you have more runway for all that internal character work than you did in book 1 when you were setting up the world, and in book 3 where you're trying to like tie it all up and like make it feel like you've done a thing straight.
Do you usually just like, as a fangirl, I want to know this, like, do you know, like when you start a new series, like, do you know, like book 1 will be about these 2 characters, book 2 will be about like this other set? Like, do you plan it all out, or do you just kind of like wait and see like what characters call to you?
Mostly it's the characters themselves are planned out in the sense that, when I start a series, I know who the couples or like who the main characters of the series are going to be. And so, for example, my last series, which was Bare Knuckle Bastards, there were 3 logical heroes and then a logical heroine. And so like I knew that. And then I always know that like big set piece ending of the 3rd book, because all of my series have like a set piece ending of the third book. But other than that, I don't know what I'm doing.
Last book.
Yeah, or the final book of the series, yes. Because the Casino series is 4 and Hellspells is 2. All my second books are quieter. Not quieter meaning, they all have like big set piece things happening and like, somebody's getting punched in the face and like, casinos are getting burned down and like docks are being exploded. But like, the books themselves are really about character in a way that the first and third are more about like, let's tell us a big world story.
Yeah, because I think in the first book you do have like a burden of like kind of setting up the world, like whether it's fantasy or like like historical.
And readers often don't gravitate to first books the way that they gravitate to the later books in the series, because I think part of that is like there's just so much, like they're taking in a world.
Yep.
There are books where I've read it when it was just book 1, and then I go, then 2 and 3 or 2 and 3 and 4 come out, and I go back and reread the first one, and I like book 1 better,
right? Because
then I can see it all, right?
Yeah.
Like Wicked and the Wallflower, I loved so much more after like going back to it after Daring and the Duke. And so I do think that there's something to be said for, the patient, you have to really like rely on the patience of the reader at that point to stick with you and be like, okay, these unfinished things in book 1 are going to, I promise, right? Like reveal themselves.
Which must be, Sarah, your readers are, they're the level of patience and excitement and joy that they have is remarkable.
It's incredible just to like see people like connect with the series and like wait to like see the payoff for like, like they know, I think they know at this point, like with the type of writing that I do, that like, with book 1, like I'm planting stuff in there, like little secrets and things that will then come like play in like later, and like book 2, like you really see a lot of that, like for Crescent City, like you see a lot of those secrets play out. By the end, there are a lot of reveals, and then especially at the end, there's like the big reveal. And like I get such like joy out of like writing. That's like, writing book 1 and being like, he. I'm like,
little do you know.
I'm planting these little details that you guys probably think I'm just being like, wordy about descriptions and things. But right there is like that huge, like, tell that like later on when you reread book 1, you'll be like, oh, you sneaky bitch. Like you put that there.
I mean, that really is the joy. Cause I wrote a series set in a casino, and, there's a giant reveal for the 4th book in that series. And like the moment where I was like, well, if this works, everyone's going to go back to the beginning and read the whole series again, Oh
yeah, I mean, like I like when I read that series, like, and like I don't want to spoil the surprise. Like I don't want to spoil the surprise for anyone reading this who hasn't discovered your amazing books yet. But like I definitely like went back and have like reread, and I was like, oh, like I'm so
that
dumb.
sneaky
like,
bitch.
Yeah. Somebody did it to me. The thing I do to them.
I mean, there is a certain level of like, snidely whiplashing your way through writing that last book where you're like, they're gonna get it. Finally, they're gonna see the plan was always there.
I think that, so can we talk about I don't know the names of, I'm like, Sarah, how long have we been friends? I don't know the name of the series, that comes after it with the sisters, the soiled S's, right? Duchess.
Yeah, Scandal and Scoundrel. It starts with the rogue not taken.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's really interesting to me about that series, though, is that book number 2 is not about one of the sisters.
No, and sometimes I regret that.
Yeah?
Really?
Oh, look, here we are. It's Confessions with Sarah's.
Sarah's. Well,
it feels out of place, right?
But I love that book. It's one of my favorites of your books. But it also, like, I was like, I'm going to get Sarah to talk about this because it feels like you really made an unusual choice. Right? You're like, let me introduce 5 sisters. Okay, let me now write a book about one of the other ones. Like a not of one of these sisters.
Well,
right?
but she becomes like sister of the heart, right? So
right. Well, of course.
I wanted to write, that was a whole separate thing. That was I wanted to write a lonely heroine.
No.
Like I wanted to write a heroine who like didn't have friends and didn't like, had never had friends, had never known what it was like to have a community, because we've talked so much about, romance and fantasy too. I mean, these are genres that are about community. They're about community building.
Yeah.
And often for me, because because like personally in my real life, I have like a very rich community of friends, I write characters who have friends. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to write a character who didn't have a friend and give her like a love story, both with a hero and with like a community of women who would become ride or die for her. And so that's why like she's like swept into this like chaotic world of the sisters in that second book. But that's a good example of a book that I think is like quieter than the other 2 because the heroine is like really figuring character shit out.
So was that just like that story called to you and you were like, I'm going with this one, like even if it's not like what was kind of in my head at the start for the series? Like I feel like even though you say you might like regret that, like you went with the story that was in your heart and like in your head and like what called to you. And I feel like that, like there's a power in that like, translates onto the page of like, the right story at the right time. And like you had something to say clearly that needed to work its way out of you.
Well, and you know what this feels like too, Sarah. There comes a point when you're lucky enough in your career that you can say to your editor, like, this is the book I'm going to write because this is the book I want to write. And you kind of say like, it might not be the book that everybody loves, but it's the book I want to write. And I was very lucky that my editor was like, yes, you can write that book and we will love it and publish it. And
well, and from the reader point of view, her loneliness is highlighted by the fact that it's in a series where we have these 5 sisters who are so, right? Like it had to be there, right? You like to highlight her loneliness, you have to show, okay, but this is what other people have. So like it makes sense to me that it's there, but yeah, it's always been. In all of our years of podcasting, I never asked you about it.
Well,
that's one of my favorites of your books.
But let's talk to Sarah J. Maas, who is a superstar. Yes. This week's episode of Fated Mates is sponsored by Mila Finelli, the author of the Kings of Italy duet. which begins with book 1, Mafia Mistress, featuring Fausto and Francesca. And Francesca is stolen away and held prisoner in Italy, a bride for a Mafia king's only heir.
Until that Mafia king decides maybe he wants her for himself.
Yeah, he does.
This amazing Mafia romance has age gap trope, obviously Mafia, so it's dark romance. It has kidnapping, and it is super duper hot.
We have talked about this one on the podcast before, so you know we love it.
Yeah, this book is available in ebook and on KU. If you would like more information about Mafia Mistress, you can click, if you have a smart podcasting link, right on the book title as you look down at your screen right now. You can also go to Mila's website at milafinelli.com.
The book is Mafia Mistress. It's the first in the Kings of Italy duet, and it is available right now free in KU. Thanks to Mila for sponsoring the show. So, Sarah, you talked about Empire Strikes Back, but do you think about when you sort of sit down and you think about like, what are the overarching stories that really like inspire you as a writer? Not necessarily second stories, but just in general, like where do you turn, what are those books or movies or, shows?
Oh man. I mean, like I am such a fangirl of so many things that like, I could sit here for another hour and talk about like everything that has inspired me. But like one of the things that I guess like to go like way, way back, like into my early youth was like Sailor Moon, which like I obsessively watched as a kid. Like it was on like Cartoon Network when I was in middle school every day at like 4:00, I think, on Toonami. And like, I would literally run home from school, like backpack bouncing, like to catch it on time, and like recorded every episode on like VHS, like including like taping over like my brother's, like, home videos. Like I just was like, I wanted every episode. And this was like before like the internet was like, it was there, but like,
not in the same way.
I was like 12, 13. Like this was like the late 90s, like, and it was, Sailor Moon was kind of like one of these series that just really struck me and like stayed with me because, I mean, like one, it's about like this unlikely heroine who is, she was like me in middle school, like terrible at math, constantly on like the brink of like, failing out, like a bit of a whiner, which I like still am. And then she has this like it's like, Buffy, she has this like enormous responsibility thrust upon her. And like over the course of the series, like, she levels up like, again and again, like literally like levels up like into like new costumes and powers. And like as she grows up, like she gains more and more of these abilities. And I think like that kind of like stuck with me as like a thing, like, in Throne of Glass and Akatar and Crescent City, like, like all my heroines, they start in that book one of like, here's an introduction to their powers. And then like, I love that like leveling up moment. And like Bryce definitely like levels up like in book 2 in Sky and Breath. And like, that was like so much fun for me to write. Cause I think I could channel some of that, like Sailor Moon, like now she's got the moon crystal, like
shooting out of her.
Yeah.
Sure.
And like, yeah. So like, that was kind of like one of my very early fandoms that like was an ongoing, very long series with twists and turns, but also like to circle back to women, like really strong female friendships that, developed and changed. And, there was the core like romance with like Sailor Moon and Tuxedo Mask that, I was totally all about. But then like the moments that I think really moved me were the ones when like Sailor Moon and like her fellow Sailor Scouts, like, came together as like friends and women and like supported each other, not just like to save the world, but like in their day-to-day lives. And like, that's, I think like a lot of the fandoms that I'm like really into like are, similar, like a Buffy.
Yeah.
Similar,
well,
different types of, like,
look, Buffy season 2 is a classic for a reason.
Oh my God.
Right?
Yes. Buffy season 2. Yeah. Like exactly. Like to the point where like, I own I have like the Buffy box set from like before, like we had all our streaming fancy stuff,
right.
But like, like I would like almost kind of like skip parts of like season 1 because I just wanted to get to like season 2. And there's like, the leveling up of like powers, responsibility, romance. But then, like, I love, like, Star Wars, which also has its leveling up of Luke, learning more about his powers. And with Star Wars, it was kind of like, I loved Leia, but like, I would watch Star Wars and like, I wanted to be Han Solo. Like, that's who, like, I wanted to like marry him, but also be him. Like, I wanted to be that cool, like, with that swagger.
Yeah. All that adventure. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Yeah. And so I think like with the heroines that I wound up like writing, like especially Aelin and Throne and Glass, like, I wanted a heroine that had that kind of swagger, who could like, walk into an enemy's stronghold and like put her feet up on the desk and, like just like chill. And like, I love that. And yeah, I mean, like Lord of the Rings was another one of my like big fandoms as a kid, and I still love it. Like I literally founded the Lord of the Rings fan club at my high school.
Oh,
yes, it was me and like my friend, and then like this like poor freshman that we like dragged into the room, I think because we needed like a certain number of members for like faculty approval. I was a nerd. I was a nerd during a time when it was like not cool to be a nerd, and I love that, like,
same,
the internet now, like, like book talk, like, like
we're ascendant now.
It's
you
like
can find your people right away.
It's amazing. And like, I mean, like when I was in high school, like no one in my high school was like into the like stuff I was into, like fantasy, like sci-fi. And so I felt very much like, am I the only person in the world that like is into this shit? And I love that, like,
Sara,
nowadays.
Where
like,
did you grow up?
I grew up in New York City, in Manhattan, Upper West Side. So I went to like a very posh private school for high school that was like not like very academically challenging and great school, but it was two of us and two and a half of us in the Lord of the Rings club. And like my friend that was in the club with me was not like as into it as I was. Like I was like full on like going to the midnight like screenings of the movies, like dressed up as Éowyn. Like I was kind of like the odd duck at my high school, though I found a group of friends that, we called each other the Goonies. And we made t-shirts, like we were each like a different Goonie. I was Mikey. Though I think in hindsight, I'm probably more like Chunk.
I think all of us.
It was wishful thinking that I was like as cool as Mikey. I was totally not. But yeah, so like, I mean, the Goonies was another one of my fandoms that like, I wish that like had an ongoing series, but they don't.
Yeah. You know what, though? So many things have been remade that I also kind of appreciate, like the purity of like the Goonies is the Goonies and it's what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I have like mixed feelings about remakes. On the one hand, like, I love them. Like, I'm like happy to get more of that world. But on the other, I'm like, is this necessary? Like, you know, like, do we need, like, the movie's perfect the first time around. Like, do we need like an updated version that's like basically the same thing, but not as good? And it's sometimes they do a good job, and sometimes I'm just like, well, that was a waste of money and my expectations.
It's hard.
Yeah.
You know what I've been thinking about related to your books, and I think this has something. I think it has something to do with second books too, but my example is not a second book. But I think that one of the things that I really love about your books is your ability, and I feel like more recently it's been happening with your heroines, your ability to write just like a heroine who is at the end of her rope, like has just, I'm talking about, I mean, Nesta was like perfect for me because so Nesta is the heroine of Sarah's last book, right? Which was Court of Silver Flames, which is the final book. Is it? No, it's not. No, it's not the final book. Of course, it's not.
Yeah, it's like the start of like the like
a new movement.
The new movement. That's
right.
Yeah, more I guess like traditional romance in the sense that each of the books going forward will be a different romantic pairing.
Right. Well, maybe this is also why I was like, oh, I love this. No, that's, I mean, but I have loved many of your books, but this book, Nesta starts the book and she is in such a dark place. Like she is, I also read this book like trapped in my house. During a pandemic, so that might have been part of it, but there was a real sense of like this character who just is so, you used the term broken before, but I feel like there are these characters, how to take a character who is like, especially a heroine who is not fully triumphant yet, and really show us like how they have to be mended and, restructured and rebuilt. And I feel like that happens here too in this series. Like you have this character who really needs to go through a journey. And then in this second book, we get to see this like kind of bruised and challenging character find triumph. And that is that is the whole point of the second the second book. Right. The second, and if you think about these, like when you think about 3-book series, you can also sort of kind of pigeonhole them into the 3-act structure. And they're sort of vaguely, if you like squint and turn your head to the side, it's 3-act structure. That sort of middle piece of any book about a character really is about like them giving themselves permission to triumph.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like with Nesta, I knew where I wanted her to start with. Like in Silver Flames before I ever began writing her books. So I kind of spent the earlier ACOTAR books setting that up.
Yeah, like ruining her poor baby.
Destroying her. I mean, like Nesta was kind of like a broken person to begin with. Like she's someone who never really, found herself or like, was just the parts of herself it felt like it didn't fit in like her environment, like growing up, and like she didn't give herself permission to like emerge from that. And like when I started writing Silver Flames, like I was in like kind of like a dark place of my own. Like after my son was born in 2018, like a couple months later, like I started having like panic attacks, and like I like had like a complete like it was like over the course of a year that like I just like my mental health took such a dive. And by like fall of 2019, like these panic attacks that I was having, like weren't going away. Like they were getting more frequent. They were lasting longer. And like, I was just in such a dark, like not great place that I finally started like going to therapy and like getting medicated, and like it changed my life. And like, there was also like a physical component of like going to this like awesome, like physical trainer, and like who actually did like teach me some of the like sword techniques that Nesta learns. And I owe a lot to Nick for walking me through. He actually like showed me like, I think like the 8-pointed star or some version of that Nesta learns. But like, I think I write those stories about like heroines being like broken and like finding their way back to themselves, but also this new triumphant version of themselves. Cause that's a journey that I like have been on and feel like I keep returning to like on like my personal life. And like those stories about healing and surviving and learning to love yourself, like, as cheesy as it sounds, like that's as important to me as like the romance element of like, like falling, like, I feel like you can't like fall in love with someone completely until
if you're right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that about Bryce, and I don't want to spoil book 1 in case people are listening that are like, this is a new series, I'll just start, but there's like a shocking like loss, right? That she has to like, that happens sort of on page that I mean, it was like kind of breathtaking. And you can't do that in a regular romance, right? In a fantasy, you can do that. And I found myself really thinking like, what does it do to like a character to then have to like face like the life I thought I was going to have is different now because of this thing that's happened and how sudden that is. And so to see her like, and then I also like, and we've talked about this, it's just like, it's 2 years and then it's like 2 years later. Right. And so we get that like some healing has happened, some things have happened off page, like where is she now? And I think it's amazing to like sort of see the way time moves in a book too. Like, it would have been so easy to have all that be book one, but instead you're like, no, her journey is going to really pick up later. So but like that, I was really like, holy shit, like that just happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Right?
sometimes, I mean, like all of us, I think, can agree, like life throws curveballs at you. And like, sometimes you have your whole like thing planned out and like
more than a curveball.
yeah, I mean, that was like a huge, I mean, that was a bomb being dropped into Bryce's life. But like, how do you go on from that? And like, how, like, it's not an easy thing of like, someone very close to you dies or something horrible happens. And like, you don't just like, I mean, maybe some people can, but like, at least in my experience, like you can't just pretend like everything's normal or maybe you can pretend, but like just moving on, like you're different. And like, who is this new person in the aftermath of all of that? And like, what do you do with yourself in the aftermath of all that? Like, how do you rebuild a life? How do you make new relationships? Like, there's so many things that like, I knew from the start when I began writing Crescent City, like with the initial kernels of inspiration, that like what would happen at the very beginning of book one. And that like the whole series would be about Bryce's journey to go from like this person that she was before that big event to like who she is afterwards and like what, like how she heals, what she chooses to do with her life. And like how to like, the new people that come into her life, like how do you learn to trust and open yourself up to them? And like, how do you find common ground with them? And one of the ways that Bryce and Hunt like bond is they both have lost, people close to them. They've both been through like horrible things and, they find each other like through those things and through like listening to each other and understanding each other.
So the thing that's also interesting about book two though is she also is, and I think this is clever, right? Like I was hoping maybe we could talk about this is, so in book two though, then she goes back and she discovers there's all this stuff she didn't know. Right. Mm-hmm. So that's another really interesting way. So instead of like, we're just MacGyvering and building up for like the big bad, it's also a really cool trick in book two when instead it's like, oh, look, there's all this stuff that I thought I'd put it to bed because I was over it or it was in the past, but the past just never passed.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
Yes. And I love like stuff like coming back like to haunt characters and stuff. Like, I mean, like one of the joys of writing this book was having like Ethan, like, for all his like George Michael, like lightsaber swinging, like, like this guy from her past, like coming back and like, the bringing with him, like, all those memories, but also like new insight into like what things had been like. And, I mean, like Ethan was a character that I just like, I don't know, side note. I really like him. I was like, I need to have like a hunky athlete join the gang.
Yes, a himbo.
Yeah. Well, and he's also, I mean, I think the other thing that's great though is he is also on his journey of dealing with like what happened. It was just as much of a bomb in his life. And so then you get like a second character who knows like really her and what she's been through. So right. And that's something like Hunt doesn't have. So, the whole thing, it's just really, as I was really admiring it as I was reading, because I was like, this is so fascinating because this is like a really good example of the second book isn't always moving forward. Sometimes it's still mining and recursive about what was in the past.
Right.
Yeah. And I actually really enjoyed that part of like showing more through Ethan about like what that past had been like, and like getting like little tidbits about Bryce in college, like doing keg stands at like 10 a.m, which like might have been based on some personal experience. Like, some of them, like some of the college stuff was based on real experiences from me, but then also some from my husband Josh that I will not reveal his own college thing. That's for him to share with the world one day. But yes, there's some of his experiences wound up making their way into these books, which is like weirdly fun for me to write about. I was one of those like college students that like I love to go out and have fun, but I also like any Saturday night I was either out at the bars with my friends or I would stay in and be writing like my fantasy novels. And like I actually kept my writing like a secret from like my college friends. Like not because I thought they would like shun me, but I just like didn't like tell them, like, and then it came out at one point.
Were you writing your first book in college? Like, is this, or do you have something under the bed?
Yeah. So I started writing the Throne of Glass series in like a very early, very terrible, different form when I was in high school. And so I wrote like roughly the first 4 books ish throughout like high school and college. And it was just like for fun. Like, it was just like, you know, a story that I was obsessed with. Yeah, just for fun. But like, it was like, so like when I was in college, I would, you know, sometimes stay home, you know, in my dorm room and work on work on these books and
work on the book.
And it came, and like, I would tell my friends like, oh, I've got too much homework. I gotta like, you know, I gotta do this paper. And then it came out at some point during like my senior year, I want to say, where like, I might've like drunkenly like confessed to my friends, like, when I don't go out with you guys on Saturdays, like it's sometimes because I'm writing my fantasy novel. And they were all like, what? But then like they instantly were like, can we read it? And I was like, absolutely not. Like, I'm not letting any of you read it.
No. No.
Like, never. I'm like, I'd rather you know me.
That's not what books are for.
Like, yeah. And I'm like, no. I was like, I just know me as the girl who likes her, like, you know, vodka cranberries and like, that's it. Let's leave it at that. But they were all like so supportive and like excited about it. And it was so sweet. But like, yeah, so I was just like weird hybrid of like shut in writer in college. And then like, I guess I just needed to like go like blow off steam and like be a like normal college kid sometimes. They're like, what is normal these days? I mean, to me, that was normal. But like, you know, if my son goes to college and he's like, I want to stay in and write books, I'll be like, okay, great, good. Just stay in. Don't do anything bad.
Perfect.
No, I would tell, I think I would tell him like, you know what, like, dude, like, that's great. But like, go like live your life, like get into little bit of trouble, not too much trouble that you get kicked out or ruin anyone else's life, but like, just
I don't
like,
have to bail you out of jail, but
like those kids from Canada on the way to Mexico. Did you guys read about this story this morning?
Insane.
Okay.
No.
A bunch of French Canadians, like a bunch of kids, new adults, were on a plane.
Their frontal lobe is still mush.
Well, they're going to be stuck in Mexico. On a plane to Mexico, they were like crowd surfing and vaping. I mean, it was like literal insanity. And I guess the flight attendants just kind of gave up. And then they all landed in Mexico. And now none of them can get home because, of course, they're all now on no-fly zones, like no-fly lists.
Oh,
and I was like, I'm going to tell my son about this later and be like, if you ever...
I mean, here's my thing. If my child ever behaved in such a manner on an airplane or with anyone in any other public place.
Yeah, no.
Like, send her home. Send her home.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
Mama's coming.
Yeah.
She'll be like, I would like to stay in Mexico. Thank you.
Seriously. Oh, Sara, it was amazing to talk to you and hear all about your books and your writing process. This is so exciting.
I had so much fun. This was awesome.
We had a great time.
So much.
Come back another time and talk about third books.
I would love that. It would be a privilege and an honor.
Well, see, here's the thing. That was such a great conversation, and I loved every second of it. And we did not talk about books at all, aside from ours. I mean, we talked about my books and her books.
Sure. But this is, you know, I think we're going to add a little something to the end where we talk about second books in romance. And what I told Sara before we started is I started making a list of like which of my books are like, okay, so which series do I love where I love the second book the best? And then I realized it was so many books that I started actually making a list. So I want to like actually read my list really fast. It's really long though, because I was like, I really love the second book. So Aurora Blazing by Jessie Mihalik, Bloodbound in the Mercy Thompson series, Cinnamon Blade by Shira Glassman, The Dating Playbook by Farah Roshan, Dreaming of You.
Oh!
Right? Heaven, Texas, the second in the Chicago Stars series. We talked about Her Naughty Holiday by Tiffany Rice as the second one in that series. Just Past Two by Elia Winters, my favorite. The second, The Lawrence Brown Affair by Kat Sebastian is a second. Love Her or Lose Her by Tessa Bailey. I love that book. Lover, Rage, and Marry, also known by its real name, Lover Eternal in the Black Dagger Brotherhood.
That's my favorite.
You'll notice my list is in alphabetical order. Luck of the Draw by Kate Claiborne, of course. That's
on my list too.
Amazing. Playing It Cool by Amy Andrews. Second book. Playing with Fire. It is a second book. Playing It Cool. Playing with Fire by Kate Meador, the one about the mayor and the woman firefighter, is a second book.
You did such good work. You're so much better at homework than I am.
The Prince of Broadway, second book. Managed, a second book. The Master, a second book. Marrying Winterbourne. Reaper's Legacy by Joanna Wild. Rock Hard by Nalini Singh. Scoring Off the Field, a second book.
Yeah, that's a good one too. Look at you.
I know, right? A Scot in the Dark, we talked about already.
Thank you.
A Taste of Pleasure, which is a category romance by Chloe Blake, is a second book, and it's perfect. And White Hot, the second in the Hidden Legacy series, is my favorite.
What?
So I was like, I love a second book.
You really do love a second book.
I love a second book.
Listing out those books, like those are all some of my very favorite books by those authors. So I think maybe I love a second book too. And classic.
Okay, listen, I can't believe I've never talked about this book on the podcast. A Beautiful Stranger by Christina Lauren is my favorite probably of their books. And it's the second in the Beautiful series.
There you go. So, I mean, like, I did not do Jen's kind of like,
I did the homework for everybody. It's fine. You moved.
Seriously, I did some homework, but I didn't do like, here are 40 books homework. But you're just trying to show off with your photo array this week.
I think, you know what? Okay, yes, although I hate doing it now because Google changed something. But it was more like as I started thinking about how much I love second books and like kind of writing them down, the list just kept growing and growing. And I was like, God, I really do love a second book.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You do. And I think we sort of touched on it in the podcast, but it's not surprising to me that romance novel readers like second books. I think about the books that people always talk about that I've written, and many of them are the second books in the series, Brazen and the Beast.
Brazen and the Beast.
What are other books that I've written? One Good Earl Deserves a Lover is like a massive favorite for everyone. And I think that when you think about it, like I said with Sara, there is a sort of real sense that a second book is where you can mine for emotion. And so romance readers like that.
Right. Well, I think the other thing I was thinking about a lot is it's a little bit different in a romance series where it's a different romantic pairing every book. Right? Like, so we talked a lot about Sara's books, which are often, right, like in the Crescent City series, right? It's
different. Yep.
The same. Although it sounds like in ACOTAR, there's a change.
In ACOTAR, it switches over on the fourth book.
Right. And so it's really interesting because I found myself thinking, okay, like I think this series, Crescent City, will be 4 books. And I was kind of like, I wonder if there'll be a switch, right? I mean, so it is really interesting, but I think it's different in romance.
Well, I don't know, because I think in romance there are different conventions, right?
Yes.
So if Hidden Legacy is a good example of like, well, that's one couple the whole way through. And so in urban fantasy, like in,
Mercy Thompson, I mentioned, right.
Exactly. So that's a separate thing. But when you're writing the way, and then for many of us, second books in the series are sort of loosely connected, right? Like it's a series about sisters. The second book is, whatever sister, or it's a series about friends. The second book is whatever friend. In some cases, like I think I do this, paranormal romance writers do this, like there, where there is a kind of a reward to the reader for reading the books in order.
Yes.
Even though they have different protagonists, then I think the second book falls into this second book conversation, this convention, where like there's more to it. The series, if you read it if you read the series in order, and you get more than like, oh, now I see them married and dancing by, but you actually get like an additional layer of plot, or like an additional, like something levels up in the second book that will ultimately be a payoff in the third or fourth book. Then I do think like these all work. Yeah. So I think it depends on the kind of writer.
Yeah, I think another book I had on my list, and it's The Undoing by Shelley Lawrenston is an example that I think is like really like, I don't know, it's like really drives on that line pretty carefully because it's technically a standalone, but I think you really need to read the first book just because like the world of the crows and like their sort of lifestyle is so intense. And there's like a lot of other characters. Shelley Lawrenston has like a million characters. So in that case, it's kind of like, it wasn't quite like Hidden Legacy where it's like the same people, but like that world really gets set out in the first one. So I really found myself thinking about like kind of why do I love the second book? And maybe it's like, okay, I already know I love this world in the series. Now I can just enjoy it.
You know what else it is, though? And this is true of all romances that are not the first book in a series, right? Which is, it almost feels like every romance novel is a little bit second book because you already met the characters.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, as romance readers, we're so trained to say,
at least
like,
one of them. Yeah.
I can't wait for so-and-so's book.
So-and-so's book.
I can't wait for that. Like, often in historicals, like, it's really heavily teed up. Like, the next book is going to be these people, right? Like, you know who Imogen is going to end up with, right?
Right.
And so, like, the sort of thirst for that as an experience gives you that, like, oh, now I've met that character. I think I'm like, I have a crush on that character.
Right.
And then you're delivered their book and it's like, here's your chance to fall in love.
And I think here's the thing that the reason why I love a second book, but sometimes the third or fourth book, though, and I'm not going to name names or anything. It's different for different people, but can be like a disappointment. Like you're so worked up to get that person's book.
Listen.
And then it's like, how do you
listen? This
Sorry,
is the
Sarah.
scariest thing for us as writers.
Of course.
Because you know, too, like when you write the book, you know, oh boy, I know who everybody is going to beg for.
Right.
And so you know there is just going to be desperation for that character. And you just hope you can deliver. It's all any of us can do is just hope we can deliver.
Yeah.
Write the best book you can and hope someone decides. And here's the other thing, you guys. If you're out there writing and you're writing one of these books, let me tell you something. Even if it's disappointing to somebody, it's also somebody else's favorite book.
Of course. That's why it's not even worth saying that the ones that didn't work for me because it is definitely going to be somebody's favorite, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the other thing, though, back to your point is what's interesting to me is in some books, right? Like, okay, with Imogen's book, we know that it's going to be Tommy. I'm already fanficking it on Twitter,
I mean,
everybody,
that's what
right?
you think, but yeah.
Right. Listen, Sarah, I'm going to come to your house and be writing at night. You're like, I guess. But sometimes you just know that which character is going to get their book next, but you don't know who the love interest is going to be.
Yeah, so you have a crush on that character, and you just want them to be happy.
Yes. And I think that those can be like really different reading experiences,
like,
right?
You know, not to sort of talk about, I know we've done a lot of talking about Cressley recently, but like, you know, I think about like Lothair, right? Where the whole fucking world was dying
like,
for it.
Could it be?
And then she delivers him this like human.
Yes.
And we were like, what?
Totally, right?
And sometimes, like, that's a really interesting choice. Like, I don't know. I thought this conversation was really great. I really loved meeting Sara, who has always been really generous about my books and really, kind about my books. And I was really interested in, like, her story. And, like, I do think of her as being somebody who kind of knocked down some doors related to sex and YA. And so I was interested to hear that story. And it was just great. It was great to have her. And if you are interested in fantasy, but love a great sex scene, you can't do much better than Sara J. Maas. So thank you so much to Sara for joining us. You can find her at sarajmaas.com. Links are in show notes. The book is the second book in the Crescent City series. It's called House of Sky and Breath. It is on shelves now this week, and you can find it wherever you get your books. Jen, happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day to you.
This is Fated Mates, everyone. You can find us at fatedmates.net. You can find us on Twitter at Fated Mates, on Instagram at Fated Mates Pod. And we love you.
We do. We love you.
Would you say that our second season is our best season?
The books that blooded us?
That was pretty good.
That was a good season.
See, it was a lot of character work. I tell you.
You were right.
Bye, everyone.